I can read. Don't overdo the astonishment. Now, this is actually quite fascinating. Here I merely have black symbols on paper and my brain is able to turn them into words and sentences. How this works, Stanislas Dehaene explains in his book Reading in the Brain. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today I've got another book review for you. Reading in the Brain by Stanislas Dehaene, published in 2009. This is a book about neurology, and neurology isn't that easy a topic. It has all those complicated terms like left and right hemisphere, frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and I think that intimidates a lot of people. However, it is an interesting topic and it is kind of a relevant topic. In his introduction, Dehaene mentions that most people have a better understanding of how their car works than of the inner workings of their own brains. And that's a shame, really. It doesn't apply to me though, because I have no idea how a car works. Now, I would like to give you an introduction to the book without delving too deep into neurological terminology. The big question in the book is, how is it possible that we are able to read? Now, in the first two chapters, Dehaene explains how reading actually works in our brains. It starts with the eyes. And actually, the eyes aren't well suited for the task. As you might know, our field of vision is, in our field of vision, we have an area in the center, the area we directly look at that we see very sharp, and towards the edges of our field of vision, our vision gets more and more blurry. If we look at a page of text, we are only able to see a few words at once, sharp enough to be able to read them. So when we read, our vision actually goes through the page in several small jumps. And that which is picked up by our eyes has to be interpreted by our brains. Our brains have to recognize the letters. And this is actually not a simple task because text comes in a lot of variations. Text can be very small, like in a footnote or the fine print in a contract. But it can also be really big, like a slogan on an advertising poster. Text can have different colors. It can be rotated or distorted. There is handwriting and there is print, and both have dozens of varieties each. In print only, there are thousands of fonts, and we can easily read all of them. In our Roman alphabet, a lot of uppercase and lowercase letters don't really look similar to each other, but our brain is easily able to notice that it's the same letter. Think of the words sight and aid. There's just a few pixels difference, but our brains can easily recognize that those are different words. At the same time, 8 in lowercase and 8 in uppercase look completely different, but our brains are easily able to recognize it's the same word. In languages such as English, where the spelling and the pronunciation are often quite different, there is an additional challenge for our brains. Now, our brains always interpret words in two ways. There is a lexical route based on spelling and a phonological route based on pronunciation. And our brains combine both to find the meaning. One aspect I found especially interesting is that our brains work parallel rather than sequential. Now, what does that mean? Imagine a computer is running a text recognition software. It recognizes the first letter, second letter, third letter, and so on. And the more letters a word has, the longer it takes to recognize it. Short words are fast, long words take long. However, this isn't the case for our brains. An experienced reader can recognize a long word just as fast as a short word. And to explain this, Dehaene uses a metaphor from one Oliver Selfridge. And Selfridge describes an assembly of demons. Imagine in your head there are dozens of little tiny demons and they all look out through your eyes, and each demon is responsible for exactly one word. Now, a word comes up in your field of vision. The word rain. Now the demon for rain will immediately, oh, me. And maybe also the demon for rail. Oh, yeah, I think. And the demon for train will probably be like, oh, maybe train. And other demons for dog or cat or serenity, they are like, not for me. And you know, the ones they showed up, there is a bit of struggle. Train? No, not train. No. All right, you do it. And but rail? No, rain. Okay. And in the end, after a short struggle, rain prevails. The word is identified. Now the thing is, all the demons look at the word at the same time. They all look at it in parallel rather than sequentially passing the word on from one demon to the next. And this enables our brain to recognize words very quickly. Now, as you see, reading is quite a complex and complicated process, and it's astonishing what our brains do when we read. And here we get back to the question, how is it possible that we can do this? Because reading and writing emerged about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. From an evolutionary point of view, this is the blink of an eye. This is almost nothing. So our brains didn't have any chance to adjust to the task of reading. We use the same brains our hunter-gatherer ancestors had. We use primate brains for reading. However, our brains seem to be highly specialized for reading. All around the world, no matter if a reader is looking at Chinese characters or the Arabic alphabet or the Roman alphabet, they always use roughly the same parts of their brains. There are certain areas that are used for reading that seem to be highly specialized for reading. But how can this be? Where do they come from? They can't have developed evolutionary. And this is called the reading paradox. And Dehaene has a theory that explains the reading paradox, and this is neuronal recycling. Dehaene believes that our brain uses existing areas, restructures them a bit for reading. Areas that are used, for example, for object recognition. And there are a lot of similarities. Imagine a caveman encounters a lion. Oh, slight déjà vu here. The caveman immediately knows this is a lion. No matter if the lion is very close or far away, no matter if it is a young lion or an old lion, a big lion or a small lion, a male lion or a female lion, no matter if he looks at him from the front or from the side, immediately the caveman knows this is a lion, and the caveman is able to tell apart this lion from, let's say, a tiger that looks similar. To further explore this, in the third chapter, Dehaene looks at how apes recognize objects. There have been experiments, for example, where researchers showed objects and abstract shapes to apes. For example, they showed them an apple, and then they merely showed them a circle with a little stem on it. And it turned out that the apes were able to recognize the abstract shapes after they had been shown the objects. In other experiments, researchers showed objects such as a fire extinguisher to monkeys. And fire extinguisher obviously is an object a monkey brain shouldn't know beforehand. And afterwards they made modifications. They removed the handle or they removed the hose, and they showed the modified fire extinguisher again to the monkeys. And it turned out in the monkey brains a similar combination of neurons was activated, but not exactly the same. There were variations. You remember the assembly of demons? There is obviously a kind of hierarchy. At the bottom, there are demons who look out for very simple, basic shapes. For example, there might be a demon who just looks out for a dark dot on a light background. And higher up, there might be, for example, a demon who looks out for eye shapes, for eyes. And this one says, oh hey, if the dot guy shows up and those three friends of his, it's probably an eye, and that's my that's where I come in. And further up, there is probably a demon who looks out for heads. Further up, there is one who looks out for human faces. Somewhere at the top, you have a demon saying, oh hey, it's my buddy Fred, and he's in a good mood today. The next chapter is about the invention of reading. Because if we rely on an existing object recognition of our brains to read, maybe the old scribes who developed our modern alphabets, and maybe the even older scribes who developed the very first alphabets, maybe they relied on basic shapes our brains already know, that are already familiar to our brains. And if this is the case, it would stand to reason that around the world, all the different writing systems we have today, like Chinese characters, Arabic writing, Roman alphabet, that they all have some basic shapes in common they all rely on. And researchers looked at that, and it turns out that, in fact, the different writing systems that are present around the world, they have a lot of common basic shapes they all use, they all rely on. Chapter 5 is about learning to read. Here Dehaene explains how we learn to read, and he describes two pedagogical approaches to teaching to read and write. The first is the classic approach we all know, where you start with single characters, single sounds, where you tell a child, look, this is the letter called D, it makes a D sound, and if you learn some more characters, you will soon be able to write dog. The other approach is the so-called whole word reading, whose proponents believe that it is more natural, more intuitive, and easier for children to start with whole words right from the beginning and to not look at individual characters. A typical exercise from whole word reading would be to show a kid a picture of a dog, and below there are a few words like cat, dog, bird, and the kid has to mark the correct word. And they also look at the silhouette, the outer shape of words. So an exercise might be to show the child a silhouette of a word, and the child has to find from a selection the word that fits into this silhouette. Personally, I didn't know whole word reading before. I don't know if it just passed by me, or if it is not very popular in Germany. In America, it seems that whole word reading is considered outdated and is considered inferior to the classical approach. However, in the educational world, there are still some factions who support it. But Dehaene clearly describes that whole word reading is in fact it does in fact not match the way we read and the way we learn to read, and the classical approach where we look at individual letters and individual sounds, that is way more natural and easier for children. In a separate chapter, Dehaene talks about dyslexia, and he describes the differences in how the brains progress, how the brains read in children who suffer from dyslexia, and what are the differences and what different kinds there are. When children learn to read, there is an interesting phenomenon, and Dehaene discusses this in a separate chapter. When children just start learning to read and write, they sometimes have a short phase where they cannot tell apart left and right, where, for example, they sometimes write words from right to left, mirrored words, and they don't notice this, and they don't realize the difference. And this is because the difference between left and right, between an image and the mirror image, isn't always considered important by our brains. Think of the caveman with the lion. Let's say during the first encounter, the caveman saw the lion from the left, and in the second encounter, the caveman sees the lion from the right. Now, it's quite healthy for that caveman to still recognize this animal as a lion, no matter which direction it is facing. However, when we are reading, this is different, because lowercase b and d are in fact not the same letter, and the same goes for lowercase p and lowercase q. So we have to teach a difference to our brain it intuitively wouldn't make. In the 8th and final chapter, Dehaene talks about the question, why are humans the only species to have developed complex culture and reading? Because if we use primate brains for reading, if we rely on object recognition that, for example, apes have as well, why doesn't an ape ever get the idea to develop writing? Dehaene explains different theories about that, and the one he himself supports is that our brains, our human brains, have a kind of mental workspace that allows for information from other parts of the brains to be collected and to be combined and for new ideas to be formed. After that, there is a short conclusion, short summary, and then the book is finished. And yeah, I enjoyed the book. I had a lot of fun reading the book. And yeah, considering it's a complex topic, I also found it rather easy to read and easy to understand. Now, obviously, the context is important here. I've also seen reviews on Amazon where people said, oh, I thought it would be easy, but it was so complicated. Now, it is an easy book about a complex topic, and that is, of course, still more difficult than an easy book about a simple topic. So keep that in mind. Furthermore, your expectations are important. For me, I want to know how things work, what the process is, and I am not that interested in the structure of the brain, in the names of the different parts and things like that. If you are interested in that, this isn't the right book to start. There is a small chart at the beginning where you can see the names of the different parts of the brain, and afterwards Dehaene uses those terms without explaining them further. So if you want to learn about the structure of the brain, you should start with a book where each of these parts is individually described, and it's described what it does and so on. And after that, you can have a look at reading in the brain. Also, please keep in mind that this is not any kind of manual. So you don't learn how to read better or how to read faster or how to better teach reading to your children. The whole point is to better understand what goes on in your own brain when you read, and to better understand how your own brain works. And for me, that worked just fine. By reading the book, I acquired a much better understanding of how reading works and what happens in my brain when I read. Now we've reached the end. Thanks a lot for being with me in this book review. If you have read the book, please let me know in the comments how you liked it. And if you haven't, of course, I'm happy to get some feedback from you. Of course, I'm also happy if you like the video or if you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. We'll see each other next week with the next channel update. Until then, I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.